In an earlier video I showed you how I took an old brass letterbox to make these texture plates which I can now use to make some jewellery from. So I used a Sharpie pen to act as a resist and I drew 4 designs on the letterbox. I placed the letterbox in a solution of ferric chloride which etches away around the drawn design. I've sawn them into 4 separate texture plates, and what I'm going to do now is to use one of these, this is the tree design, to make a pendant. So I've got a piece of silver here that I took from my scrap pot. I took a load of pieces from here, melted them down. So I put it through my rolling mill a number of times, annealing it in between to keep it soft. So now I'm going to put it through the rolling mill with the texture plate to transfer the tree design onto the silver. So I'm just putting it through the rolling mill with the texture plate. So I finally managed to get this texture on here. I gave up on the first piece of silver that I prepared, it wasn't thick enough. The texture on the plate isn't particularly deep, so it was quite difficult to get the pressure hard enough to make a good imprint, but I think if I just sand that lightly, you can see that the texture's there. So I'm just going to anneal it again to make it soft, and then I'm going to flatten it with my rawhide hammer and then cut out my template. So I've just cleaned it in the pickle pot just so that I can see the texture a bit clearer. This is my template. So I'm just going to place it on and draw around it. And then I need to cut it out with my saw. So I've got my mask on and I've got a big piece of leather in my lap to catch all the dust. So it's a bit rough around the edges, having just cut it out. So I'm now going to sand the edges on some coarse sandpaper, work my way down through the finer papers to soften the edges and get them nice and smooth. So I've gone all around the outside edge now, and I've taken some off the back to smooth it. So to do this bit, I'm taking a fat round piece of wood, wrapping it in sandpaper so that I can get that edge nice and smooth, and again I'll work down the grades of sandpaper to the smooth ones. So of course you can use your Dremel sanding tools to do this, but for me I like to do it by hand where I can, because I like the feel of the silver and it just gives it that really handmade rustic feel. So I'm quite happy with this now. The next thing is to punch some holes to take my jump rings to hold the chain. I'm going to use my hole punch now to punch these holes. And now I'm going to tidy up the back because they're a little bit rough. So I'm going to use these 7mm jump rings to hang the chain from, and what I want to do is solder them closed, but solder them so that the joint is actually right in the middle of the hole, and I'm going to solder them to the hole to close the hole and keep the jump rings rigid. Got my little helper with me now. Molly always likes to be where the action is, so it's time for a 5-minute break. So I just want to show you there, you can see I've balanced my little solder chip. I fluxed up the silver, put my jump ring in place, and I've got a tiny piece of solder, medium solder, just balanced there waiting for me to get the torch on it. So I've managed to get my three jump rings soldered onto the piece. The reason I wanted them to be rigid is because the chain's going to come like this, and if these were loose they just pull in with the chain. So the only other thing I need to do before I pickle it and polish it is to flatten these jump rings a little, just to make them oval. I did have to straighten them a little bit after soldering because they were leaning. There. So that's now going into the pickle and then into the tumbler for a few hours to polish it up. This is the pendant now it's come out of the tumbler, and you can see that the texture is much more obvious now. So the next thing I'm going to do is blacken it in liver of sulphur to emphasise those branches on the trees. So it's in a solution here of 1 drop of liver of sulphur and boiling water. Smells like rotten eggs. You can see it going black there. So here it is after it's been in the liver of sulphur. Lovely and dark. And I'm just going to very lightly buff over the top and with a soft nail buffer, and you can see how that texture is emphasised. So I'm now going to polish it with my Dremel and some Tripolium Rouge, get it really nice and shiny, and pop the chain on. And here's the finished pendant on its chain. A beautiful texture.